Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. In fact, the term "okay groomer" is actually really precise. Like, it's actually carving out exactly what it is about this ideology that is so sick. It's not that we have an objection to people, adults kind of, being left alone. It's not that we want the government to be like reaching into your bedroom or whatever. It's that we don't want the government and the state and the sort of like theocratic techno apparatus that has grown like a cancer upon our regime these many years to be infiltrating the very brain crevices of children before they learn to speak. And I actually think that like that is, an accurate identification of the phenomenon that we are seeing that sets it apart from whatever, most nice people, I think, don't want to be like, bigots or whatever. Most people don't actually want to be like knocking on people's doors to find out what kind of sex adults are having, but they don't want grooming. Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined by a pretty full complement today. We have publisher and president Ryan Williams, editor James Poulos, and managing editor Seth Barron, and much to discuss, including a whole segment just about one clip. When we started talking off mic about what we were going to talk about, I said, I don't know if we can make a whole segment out of just one clip. And Ryan said, au contraire. And then everybody else was like, it's a really good clip. And it is. It's a really actually rich and riveting and sad and hilarious clip. This is it's available on Twitter. If you just go to @RNC Research, we can't really play it for you because the audio is just sort of empty mutterings and murmurings, which is sort of appropriate because the video shows Joe Biden just sadly tottering about in a room with his entire high level cabinet. Like Kamala Harris is there. Who else can we see here? There's just an admiral. Amy Klobuchar is there, and it's the first White House visit by President Obama in 5 years. So it's Obama's, return to the White House, and truly, you couldn't have staged it better. It's like Biden kind of tries to shake hands with some people. Nobody is paying him any attention. There's a crowd around Obama, just looking like, oh, the boss is back in town. And so everybody, of course, was talking about this, and we found it suggestive, like dropping the pretense like this and just letting the old man kind of potter about confusedly in his sort of sad state of uncertainty about where he's supposed to go, while, the real power players in the room get together and talk to the big guy, was really astonishing. So literally no one wants to talk to Joe Biden is the caption of this. There's much to say about it, so I'm just going to open the floor for people to weigh in.
I thought this was just stunning. Really staggering. It's like they say that when Trump became president, like he thought he was coming in and he was going to be the CEO of a large corporation, right? And that the president has executive authority and really gets to run the show and gets to do things. But the U.S. government doesn't really work like that. America doesn't really work like that. As he found out, the swamp is persistent. The deep state is fairly intractable. And that was illustrative. But seeing Joe Biden, like literally just turning in circles with no one making an effort to talk to him. And this is the inner circle of power. It's like a shadow, like a cloud had passed over him, and and it was just this demonstration of how the regime can like turn on its own putative leader. And the fact that, and the spectacle of it, the way in which like the camera, it wasn't the camera was just kind of panning over the crowd, and there was no, there was no, it was just a party basically. And seeing Biden trying to get Obama's attention, like patting him on the shoulder, and no one was making room for him. No one was paying any attention to him. Just the idea that the regime can turn its back on you, even if you're the president. It was just so strikingly portrayed. And it's almost as though it was stage managed that way, but it wasn't really. I mean, I don't think that someone behind the scenes was like, okay, we're going to do it this way, and we're just going to let everyone see. But they did. Everyone saw that. I mean, what was the last? I mean, this goes back to like Edith Wilson. I mean, what was the last time we really had a president who was utterly? I mean, I guess Reagan kind of had very diminished capacity, but even then, like he was surrounded by people who worshipped him and who did everything they could to protect him. And they protected Wilson, they protected Roosevelt. The idea that the regime would lead its own figurehead out to dangle in the wind like that's what's stunning. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I wonder. The interesting thing to me was that at least in the section of the clip you're talking about, Seth, the most striking, where as you say, Biden's trying to get Obama's attention. Obama pays him no mind. He's kind of looks lost. Nobody's paying attention to him. Kamala is tied at the hip to Obama, and she's, pumping all the hands right next to him. That was interesting to me. You always reading the tea leaves of who's up and who's down in Washington, of course, is a sport as old as American political time, but it's always sort of interesting. So you have these competing things right now, right? You have some of the Biden inner circle waging what's clearly a shadow comms war against Kamala. Kamala is providing them plenty of ammunition. Her chief of staff just quit, is that right? And she's lost a bunch of senior staff members in the last 6 to 8 months because she's unprepared when she speaks in public. It's sort of remarkable how unprepared she is, how kind of just dumb she seems with her rhetorical stumbles. So it looked like Kamala's stock was falling. And it's not that Biden's was rising, but it was rising just by default because his vice president was so unimpressive. I mean, it's never good for an administration in general to have this kind of public embarrassment, international and domestic, in the form of Kamala Harris. But now we get this. So a part of me thinks it was kind of stage managed, Seth. It's Obama trying to save Kamala in preparation for helping to ease Biden out. We all have to remember that Obama, unlike any other previous president in the modern era, at least, really at all, stayed in Washington. And his senior staff, many of whom went into the Biden administration, others like Ben Rhodes, seem to be working a kind of shadow government and behind the scenes. It shouldn't be a shock to anyone familiar with how Washington works that Obama would still, cut a pretty wide path in the behind closed doors and influencing the direction of the party. So the whole thing taken together is, I think, speaks volumes. It'll be interesting. We've talked about this before. The Democrats have a real problem. Biden clearly is diminished and diminishing. He's clearly an old man losing his faculties. He can still get out there and kind of perform for a few hours a day. So the wheels aren't fully off. You have a very unpopular vice president who would presumably take the reins if some 25th Amendment thing was orchestrated, or Jill Biden decided that, it was finally time for Joe to go. And he just, it just for his health or for whatever reason. And yet you have Obama seemingly booing Kamala at this event. Maybe that was just her cunning and she kind of made it happen so that those were the optics and it wasn't really a part of the plan. But I don't know, the court intrigue in the Obama, I keep doing that, in the Biden administration is fascinating. And it's like you kind of implied this, Seth, in how the spirit of how you were talking about this. You almost can't look away. It's intriguing and horrifying and embarrassing all at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, the press photos from this event are definitely telling a different story. So there, one does wonder, right, like how much control they have over these video clips. You look at some of the stuff that like AP and Reuters are putting out, and it's exactly kind of what you would expect if we were a normal country living in a normal time. You know, they're bumping fists, they're shaking hands, they're discussing. Kamala's in the background making kind of like internet-y reaction faces, turning her face into an emoji. Like there's always my sort of question about some of the dynamics you were describing, Ryan, and maybe James will have sort of insight about this, is, you know, I always wonder how much real awareness or control these sort of oligarchic, you know, these big oligarchic machines have over the way that their events are sort of broadcast out and turned up into the internet sea. Like, it just seems like so much of the press, the media apparatus is designed to create, as James might say, these televisual images, right? Stage the thing for a period of time and, like, you know, get everybody in line doing what they're supposed to do. And then you can go back to infighting, like, once the camera's off. And of course, online, the camera's never off. And so the fact that you're actually on a set, not in the White House when you're getting your COVID shot, or the fact that you know, had to put your mask on to walk to the podium, even though you had it off backstage, like, all of this is suddenly laid bare. And what's interesting to me, the other wrinkle in this is, like, I had sort of thought that Obama is, like, kind of second only to Trump here, and that he actually is kind of aware of digital media and social media. And so there is a sense in which, like, if he, it wouldn't be beyond him to, like, kind of want this image of himself as just still more virile, more in charge, more dominant compared to this, you know, doddering old man. It wouldn't surprise me if he had some desire for that to be, like, slipped out even under the sheen of all these press photos.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was a lot of criticism directed Russia's way not that long ago for carrying on this sort of postmodern form of governance where it became, like, not worth anyone's time or energy trying to parse what was really going on. Sort of like opposition parties that were funded by the regime, and sort of like, you know, they'd maybe contradict themselves, and it would be sort of impossible to ascertain what was really going on. And some of it is a function of media and of the way that you know, TV used to be, like, if it's on television, then it's really happening. Like, CNN gained its reputation back in the old days for, you know, putting a real live human being in front of real live events and sort of telling you what was going on as it was happening. That trust has been destroyed by digital technology, and in some ways, you know, long overdue, but in other ways it creates problems. Yet it's hard to escape the feeling that whoever is at the controls right now in Washington, they are off screen altogether. It's not Barack Obama, it's not Joe Biden, it's none of those people in that clip. And so, although, you know, from a media standpoint, it's tempting to say that the only way to win is to not play the game and to just, like, accept that the regime is an omnishambles and to move on. At the same time, it raises these questions about, like, well, okay, you know, who is really the responsible party here? And, you know, and even if it's not a person or a group of people who, you know, is at the command center in the bunker in the mountain, sort of like malevolently pressing all of the buttons at once, you know, that sounds far-fetched just to describe it, but it doesn't have to be that kind of person. For someone, you know, where does the buck stop? And if the buck really stops nowhere, and we really are just sort of at the mercy of this swarm that has emerged, that's inconsistent with our form of government. And maybe it takes getting to this point for people to really, in their soul, say, like, yes, the administrative state was a mistake. Yes, this thing has launched in a direction that there's really no coming back from. And although it might be painful and might take a long time to actually do for real, it's time for the pendulum to swing back. And let's face it, you know, Congress is going to not be able to do anything if this continues. I tried to tell the Congress this when I was last on the Hill. If they don't start reasserting themselves and clawing back some of these constitutional prerogatives, then the people will have no representatives, and they won't be able to throw out the folks in the administrative state who can't be voted out, and who even presidents struggle to remove, as we saw with Trump. So, you know, that's a lot for one little clip, but I do think that it speaks volumes still.
Yeah, you know, another sort of news item that we're not going to devote a whole segment to today, but that is still significant, is this thing with Elon Musk, right, where he bought some astonishing number of shares in Twitter and they put him on the board. And so now everybody's kind of tweeting piteously at Elon, like, bring Trump back, and it does sort of speak to this phenomenon that you're describing, James, that like increasingly we suspect that somebody who can exert control over the contours of our digital communications technology is much more in a position to be sort of making ultimate decisions about our lives that will affect our daily lives than our elected legislators. And as you say, that's a disaster, because it means that, like, the only reason that people are excited about the Musk purchase is because he alone among like these various figures does not come across as this kind of impenetrable cyborg that like refuses to even take the people into account or do us the courtesy of, telling the truth about what's going on behind the scenes. So there is this weird, like, we're sort of at the mercy of this is the nice oligarch, who's buying, and no knock on Musk. Like, I'm kind of a fan, but whatever you feel about him, it speaks to the real sense that our leadership, the people who are really making decisions and pulling the levers of control, are completely impenetrable and totally beyond our access.
Yeah, and something else that occurs to me, it's almost as though if that whole thing yesterday was staged, I mean, maybe it was because like some people, like some powerful members of the oligarchy, like, I don't know, the tech people or some finance people or who knows who, are getting nervous about the perception that there's nobody in charge. So it's almost like maybe this was done just to say, don't worry, Obama, we've still got some gravity here. There's somebody running the show. You don't need to take direct control. You know what I mean? Like one part of the regime telling another part of the regime that no, we still have the foundation is still solid. We got this.
Yeah. It's a version of, I don't know if it was George McBundy. I think it was maybe him, but I don't know if it was him. It doesn't matter. But, back in the day, too long ago, but definitely a different era, the joke was that the leaking to the New York Times was the best interagency memo system that one could have. Because the normal system, people would just ignore it. But if you wanted to, screw with state from DOD, you leaked a story to the New York Times and they had to grapple with it. This is maybe a version of that. That's an intriguing hypothesis, Seth. I kind of like it. One part of the oligarchy signaling to the other that they need not take drastic action, that in fact there's an adult in the room, even if he's kind of, stage left or off stage. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the sort of incompetencies and befuddlement of the regime, the other thing that we wanted to talk about today is the fact that all these sanctions on Russia that were supposed to be our grand kind of act of nonviolent war, they don't really seem to be working very well. And stipulated at the outset that this may change. The ruble may collapse, but as of right now, it's basically right about where it was before we started, banning all the oil and levying all of these sanctions and freezing all of these assets. It's at 84. The ruble's at 84 to the dollar, which is basically right where it was when Putin invaded. And as far as I can tell, although I am not an economist, just as I am not a biologist, as far as I can tell, there's kind of two dimensions to this. One is a little bit external and one's a little bit internal. I mean, first of all, the unity of the West in levying sanctions and trying to like shoulder Russia out of the so-called global economy. The unity of the West in that endeavor doesn't amount to the unity of the world. And China is still a very powerful trading partner for Russia, as are a number of other countries. And when you sanction country, or when you make their exports increasingly rare, you drive up the price of their exports, and so they're able to get higher prices for the stuff that they sell where they're able to sell it. So that's one thing. Oil prices going up and so forth, the price of Russian assets and so forth. But then there's all sorts of finagling going on within Russia. Like they've raised the interest rate to something like, I think they raised it to 20%. There's a requirement that 80% of any money that Russian businesses make overseas be swapped into rubles. which that part of it, again, not an economist, that part sounds like kind of a good idea. And then, the Russian brokers have been banned from selling securities owned by foreigners. So there's all sorts of, measures that have been taken, kind of extreme measures in extreme times that have been taken by the Russian government to prop the ruble up, and it seems to be working, at least for now. I mean, I was reading on NPR about how this is just a Potemkin currency and it's all gonna, fall apart in a bit, and I can see how that might be, but it also seems a bit embarrassing for the regime for the Western regimes to be kind of like flexing its economic muscles and, exerting that soft power. And so we don't have to go to war, but we can just totally shame and exile this country and bring them to their knees that way. And, I don't doubt that that individual Russians will suffer and are suffering from this kind of stuff. But, we are also inflicting all kinds of pain on ourselves. The gas prices that are skyrocketing, all the sort of increasing, the endless inflation that we're having to deal with. And to what end? I mean, what do you guys make of it?
Well, I mean, Russia is an advanced economy and they make plenty of things. They have lots of stuff. And, a friend of mine who's married to a Russian woman, he said, look, they can live on rock soup. They went for it's not like they're completely addicted to, manufactured consumer products and imports the same way that we are. If the rest of the world decided to embargo us and we couldn't, I don't know, get replacement TV antennas or whatever the hell, I mean, TV antennas, I'm really dating myself, but whatever. If we were starved of consumer products, we would have some kind of revolution. The Russians went for 75 years of Soviet rule. They didn't have any imported goods, and they've been under sanction already for years. I mean, they just make do. And they've got plenty of stuff. They've got India. I mean, India and China these are massive trading partners. They'll be fine. It's so funny to think that, I mean, the real Potemkin currency might be the dollar. And that's that's the amazing thing. I mean, we published a piece at American Mind this week by Milton Ezrati talking about how, look, the problem with dumping the dollar as the world's reserve currency is that at this moment, there really isn't anywhere else to go. And China isn't going to open its currency to be a real floating, have a floating rate and so forth. And they have all kinds of manipulations. So, it's kind of like the currency of last resort, but who knows how long that's going to last. It seems really bad. And now they're doing something with gold that I don't quite understand, pegging the ruble to gold, but it sounds like it's less than the current price. Maybe that's to drive up the demand for rubles. I'm not exactly sure how that all works. I'm not an economist either.
Speaking as someone who's also not an economist.
Oh, you mean everybody on this podcast? Yeah, go on. Do go on.
You don't have to be an economist to notice that the world supply of grain is highly dependent on Russia and Ukraine alike. I think somewhere north of 25%. And so the repercussions of not just the war, but the sanctions that seem designed to prolong the war in some ways, as much as to put pressure on Russia to end the war. These things are having global impact, and an impact, right where billions of people feel it the most, and where it creates the most unrest and risk of mass violence, which is hunger and starvation. So, this is more than just twisting the screws on Russia. I think that we are, we're seeing deglobalization in action, and it is going to be painful. And to a degree, it makes sense for, say, the president of the United States to communicate directly with the American people and say, hey, remember when we were going to unite the whole world and turn the world into Americans, and everyone was going to be friends online, and we were going to perfect rule on this planet? That was actually never going to happen, and we realize that now, and it's going to be painful, and we're very sorry. But that's not exactly what we're hearing. What we're hearing is that Vladimir Putin is to blame for everything bad that happens to you, from the price of gas to the price of crab legs, which are now about, I think, 50 Canadian dollars per little spindly back leg. I saw that floating around online today or yesterday. And the scapegoating, the scapegoating is, I guess, is always going to be with us, part of human nature. But we're really owed more by the folks who got us into this mess and are now very painfully trying to move us on to their next bright idea. We're not going to get it, but it's something that I think more and more people are becoming aware of, painfully so.
Yeah, just to clarify a bit what Seth was talking about. So Putin had, through some currency and energy requirements that he's put in place, that is to say, he's pegging the ruble, as Seth said, to gold. It's roughly a little under $2,000 per troy ounce, or the equivalent. He's sort of set a floor of the price, and he's also demanding that energy prices, but foreign imports of Russian energy, that is natural gas, among others, have to be paid in rubles. So he's sort of he's creating a kind of commodity / gold based, or at least linked currency in the ruble. And some, the economists have speculated, or the sort of mixed bag of economists / geostrategists think it might be the beginning of the end of the U.S. petrodollar. That is part of the reason the U.S. dollar was the global reserve currency for so long, and still is, was energy, and especially oil, was traded in dollars across the world by various regimes. So it sort of was this backstop to what has long been, since the 70s, a fiat currency, like most international currencies. The U.S. dollar, it kind of had a quasi-commodity aspect to it, just because of the high volume in which it was used to trade a certain specific commodity, that is oil and energy more broadly. So it's interesting. We'll see what this means for what might be the rise of a kind of, as the Zero Hedge guy put it in an interview with RT, that maybe the emergence of a multilateral, kind of much more decentralized global currency regime without the dominance of the U.S. petrodollar. It will take a while to see if that actually plays out. The U.S. remains a huge place and a huge economy compared to Russia. But these steps taken by Putin, and taken because of the situation that he created, he seems to be manipulating it to his advantage, and kind of mucking about in ways to his advantage with the international currency system. It's all very interesting. And, if we could sort of take a value neutral view of all of it, it's, well, we'll just leave it at interesting, I suppose. I think it puts the lie to, it also very much, the recoup of the ruble, and just the various hard facts about the Russian military, the Russian economy, the geography of Eastern and Central Europe. It really puts the lie to, the insanity of Biden saying last week or whatever it was, that for God's sakes, this man can't remain in power. So all of this, I think, will have our elites, as has been the case with them a lot in recent decades, looking foolish and myopic and incompetent at the end of all this.
The thing is, it's when they're in that position is when they are most terrifying. Yeah. They're really, even as interest in this war and the plight of the Ukrainians dwindles, they're just ramping up the atrocity propaganda, talking about, chemical warfare, biological warfare, genocide, war crimes, all this stuff. It seems like there's definitely probably a lot of people in the administration who, and clearly in the media, who really think, well, we need to go to war. We need a full-on regime change war here. Everybody says, well, that's absurd, but this is, war is the health of the state, right? That's like Randolph Bourne.
Yep.
That's pretty out there, but we certainly have a statist group in there. And as far as they're concerned, a good war, there's like nothing better than to, strengthen America. So I'm kind of worried about it.
Yeah, the two options that they have to cover their nakedness, since, as James rightly points out, they're simply not going to repent. They're not going to do it as the courtesy of saying they were wrong. The two options are to turn their sort of scapegoating and aggression outward or inward. And it has always seemed, from the beginning of this kind of Ukraine cataclysm, it has always seemed to me like there's a weird fritzing kind of fuzzy dividing line between the overheated rhetoric of online and the truly bizarre, bonkers things we might actually do in real life. And of course, that's not the only place where this is true, but it's particularly pressing to me. Like you see people mouthing off, LARPing on Twitter about this. It's Ukraine with Ukraine stands or falls Western civilization, and you can talk that way online, but when the dividing barrier between your screen and real life starts to kind of fritz and blur, it's like some of this stuff might actually start bursting out off of Twitter and into real life to the tune of like many, many dead people. Of course, this is already something we've seen with we're going to talk in a second about all the trans stuff and the grooming of kids in schools. Catherine D has pointed out on our site and elsewhere that like that stuff all began in Tumblr. So it's like if you live your whole life and your whole intellectual world is kind of taking place in this universe of pixels where everything seems kind of unmoored from the hard, cold realities of like geography and your body and the actual goods and services. Like you can say all sorts of things and develop all kinds of memes and rhetoric that when you actually like port them into meat space suddenly turn into complete hellscapes. And I do sort of feel as if there's a real danger one way or another, whether in getting into war in Russia or just turning all that energy back again on quote unquote domestic terrorists. There's always a danger that this stuff kind of spills over off of the tweets and into the streets.
Yeah. And Bill Kristol's now tweeting, it seems like whenever he gets up in the morning, for God's sake, this man can't remain in power. So anyone who's kept an eye on the last 20 years of American foreign policy should be worried by that. What we've seen throughout this Ukraine crisis, which is the alignment of the sort of neocon never Trump establishment with a certain semi-hysterical liberal internationalism that says, Putin, because he's on the wrong side of history, now must go. And actually, I'll say one good word for Biden, but despite his hot mic moment, he has seemed to be insistent that we are not going to help NATO get engaged with Russia, and we are not putting U.S. troops anywhere near or getting them involved in some conflict with Russia. That sort of old nuclear power realism is welcome, but then we're thrown back upon the question we raised in the first segment, which is how much exactly is the commander-in-chief in control of his defense and diplomatic establishment, and his performances in public do not give us much. And then these sort of, through the looking glass, or really through it looked like a reporter's sort of iPhone recording from one angle that was very unflattering to Biden. It doesn't seem like he's in firm control of his administration.
And who's to say that the investigation, all the news about Hunter Biden, yesterday's weird debacle, visually, that, maybe this is pressure on Biden precisely because he's saying that he won't go to war. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is how they're screwing with him. I still think that when he pulled out of Afghanistan, it seemed as though the generals and that whole MIC community, just the military industrial people, it looked like they botched it intentionally out of in a fit of pique that he was like breaking their rice bowl. You can't understate their power. And, if Biden's not rowing the right way, they could, that could be grounds for getting rid of him as far as they're concerned.
To me, all of this that we've covered, and we haven't even gotten into the trans component of the current thing, trans itself now being totally, totally enlarged as a concept to go well beyond the bounds of anyone's particular sex or gender. The current thing as it is known, it's all very much at the forefront of this unfolding debate about whether America is ultimately cursed in a certain sense, sort of captive to or unable to outrun the fatal flaws of the continental Enlightenment. I was at Pepperdine a few days ago talking about the book, and you got some really good questions from the kids in the audience. This is public policy school, so they're master's students. They're heavily self-selected. And, I got the inevitable question about whether liberalism is the Antichrist and Dugan is right, and whether we're facing geopolitics of the end times, and whether America is sort of stuck in this death spiral or stuck becoming the sort of, global homogenized state that, Straussians and not so Straussians alike are afraid of. And my response was, this is why Americanism is important. And there are a few different definitions of Americanism out there, all the way from the one that you will get through the Claremont Institute to the one that you'll get from someone like David Glernter. Very, very contested term. I think, Claremont's got it pretty well figured out, of course. But if we try to identify the true, Platonic form of liberalism and wager our survival as people on being able to properly define liberalism and intellectually understand whether the ideas of liberalism are going to destroy us or not. I mean, at a certain point, as an American, you have to say, I don't care, because the common sense, the shared understanding of people who are not going to be able to port out of American civilization anytime soon matters more to the way that we craft our state and the way that we conduct statecraft than an intellectual understanding one way or the other of liberalism. The whole point of America, in a certain respect, is that the architecture of the regime, although it's clearly didn't come out of thin air and has intellectual roots and philosophical roots that can be traced, yes, back to early modern liberal political thought, but also back thousands more years to not at all liberal Republican thought. It's all there. And when you're founding a regime, you are using the material that is in front of you, and you are doing your best to give to your people a form that is going to serve them well into the future beyond what any human being can predict. And I really, I'd like trying to diagnose what is going wrong with our regime and why. Pinning this stuff on America is a way of sort of shortcutting what seems to be this huge kind of intellectual obstacle course. But in another way, the people who are trying to do that shortcutting are typically people who want to say that, look, America is just like liberalism on steroids, supernormal liberalism, whatever drug you want to use. And then it's this unfolding of this abstract logic, and it's going to destroy the world. And Americans need to remember that there was a long time when our regime was not captive to the intellectuals, and where weaponized intellectuals were not the machinery of the state. Even right up until World War II, with all the New Deal, all the progressivism, all the Woodrow Wilson and everything, it really wasn't until post-World War II period when you get this tremendous influx of intellectuals and scientists into the United States who were convinced that the only course of action to keep the world from killing itself, as Donald Trump likes to say, was to intellectualize and scientize the federal government as much as possible and concentrate that power as much as possible in the hands of a small number of unelected folks. That was the decision that was made. And we are still very much living in that world. And that world, even though that world has transformed itself in ways that it didn't understand, it's not serving us. It's serving us more poorly as we see as the months go on. And we need to change, and we should be able to change by focusing on our memory of what it is to be an American, more than by trying to prognosticate about the future of the disincarnate idea of liberalism.
Yeah, that's well said, and it speaks to another, perhaps equally picayune and ultimately fruitless internecine debate, which we wanted to give some time to today, of course, because this is the roundtable. No, I'm kind of joking. There is an interesting discussion going on online about the fact that these Florida law about, parents' rights, that you're not allowed to teach kindergarten through third graders about alternative sexualities, and the general movement against, trans surgeries and hormones for kids, and indoctrinating kids into various sexual ideologies at a young age. All of this stuff is now like really kind of taking off as a cause for the right to win on, as I believe we discussed on this podcast, these many weeks ago. So kudos to us. And it seems as if the rallying cry for this, the kind of online meme about this, has become OK Groomer. And I think we called one of our episodes that a while back. OK Groomer meaning, these people, when you outlaw teaching about transgenderism and homosexuality and various alternative sex acts in school at the age of 3 or whatever, and until third grade, these teachers start freaking out as if, in fact, what they really wanted to do was talk to your kids about sex. And I think it was Seth who said, why the real Republican strategy here is why do you want this? And so people start saying, OK, groomer, because these folks are reaching into your kid's sexual psyche. And there has been now, of course, predictable, perhaps left-wing response to this, which is the new Red Scare. Ryan sent into our Slack this funny tweet from Christina Pushaw, I'm not sure how to say that, but she's tweeting about, all these different articles, the Washington Post, Vice.
She's DeSantis's media PR person. Yeah.
Right. Do you know how to say her name? I can
sorry.
never. No, yeah.
Forgive us, Christina.
This is Christina Pushaw. I assume it's Pushaw. Anyway, all of these headlines: the new Red Scare, conservatives are smearing "Don't Say Gay" opponents as pedophile groomers. Teachers who mention sexuality are grooming kids. Why are Republicans so concerned about grooming? Right, this sort of you really fixated on grooming. Meanwhile, there's some kind of discussion going on the right about whether really, in fact, this is actually about grooming, or whether it's more of a kind of transhumanist ideology that just happens as a byproduct to trend toward normalizing pedophilia and giving cover for perverts. Anyway, it's all kind of riveting in a certain sort of way, and one is tempted simply to say, come on, man, this is the first winning slogan we've gotten in who knows how many moons. But are any of you guys more worried about this slogan than I am? I'm pretty much full steam ahead.
To quote one of Woody Allen's more recent movies, definitely not one of his best. Whatever works. I've been one of my. I don't mean to oversell this too much, but I've used this phrase on Twitter more than once, which is lean into the culture war. It seems to be working for the right. First, it was with critical race theory, and if you poll normal Americans on this kind of stuff, especially when you fairly represent what is currently acceptable in government schools and the trend lines for teaching about sex, both sex education and emotional and social learning. ESL is sort of a blanket term for some of this stuff. And then also the racialized critical race theory, critical social justice. That's the sort of blanket term for a lot of this new way of teaching children about group identity and American civic history and the history of social justice in America and all the rest. When you poll normal Americans on it, they're kind of appalled by it across demographics. And so I say, this is fine. The thing about the calling them groomers, our friend Nate Hochman started a little firestorm yesterday on Twitter by saying he thought, in the narrow sense of the term groomer, this was a rhetorical mistake because it made us being people on the right, sound crazy, and it's not a winner, et cetera, et cetera. And the backlash was swift and across the spectrum of folks on the right. It wasn't universal, of course. Nate has his defenders. His narrow point is correct, of course. I don't agree with his judgment about it being politically a mistake, but the narrow point is correct. It's a bit unfair to call everyone. There are I'll put it this way. There are undoubtedly a huge number of K through 12 teachers who, for whatever reason, because of what they were taught in ed schools, or because of what they think is healthy for children these days, think that these things should be taught in the ways that they're teaching them, and might even agree with the leading edge of the left on where this should go, or at least in the classroom presentation, but are nonetheless not themselves grooming children so that they can take advantage of them sexually. That narrow point, sure, true. But look, this is a political slogan. It's a polemic. So like all political slogans, it's kind of polemical, which means it captures a larger truth. It fires people's passions. It seems to be working quite well. And I just, James Lindsay, who's been very good on this, he had this Twitter thread about it last summer, I think. And he's now elaborated on it in recent months before all this blew up yesterday, of course, with a few podcast long ones on this, basically talk about grooming in school. And he takes it in the broader sense. So I just wanted to give his sense of it because I think it seems correct to me. He doesn't quite put it this way, but if I can boil it down, he says, calling them groomers is perfectly acceptable. So in the narrow sense, there actually are quite a few groomers and pedophiles and sexual abusers in our public school systems. Mike Cernovich pointed out on Twitter, it wasn't original to him, but he just highlighted it yesterday, that if you look at the per capita stats, public schools are much more abusive to children sexually than the Catholic Church ever was. This is a sort of hidden, it should be a scandal, which just doesn't get enough airtime, but it's a fact. We all know why this happens. It has a lot to do with the fact you can't fire public school teachers, really. So in the narrow sense, there are plenty of groomers in public schools. In the political sense, the project of queering the classroom traces its roots way back to cultural Marxism in various ways, and has to do with sort of separating children from the religious or otherwise troglodytic views of their parents and preparing them for global citizenship and citizenship in a woke America. That's certainly, I mean, it goes back to Marx at least, right? You get the kids and you educate them, and you can affect the future regime because those people will then be the movers and shakers of that regime 20 years hence. And then, so they're grooming them politically to kind of reject a good portion of the parents of America's worldview, if I can put it that way. And then in sort of intellectual grooming as well, in the sense that it's part of this long project. If you look back at its theoretical roots, it's part of a long project with tendrils, back to the turn of the 20th century and the rise of the desire to effect a kind of cultural Marxist revolution. And the place to start is at these 2 points. This was Lindsay's best insight, I thought. And he knows all the literature on all this, so can do the whole academic dive. But at these 2 points, you deconstruct and alienate and cause to feel guilty what is for now the majority population, that is white kids, because of you teach them about their identity and how it's been oppressive in the past, how white supremacy is bad, how they should feel shame for their whiteness. So you kind of deconstruct them, and then you give them a new identity, which is the whole panoply of queered identities, be it trans, bi, pansexual, whatever. And then you have a malleable resource in your hands. And as we can see, the reform in Florida was pretty modest, which was, you can't teach this stuff when they're really young. And I think that the putative goal of that is to kind of put a firewall on this whole process. So I think grooming is a perfect term, especially politically, for what's going on here, because it causes some outrage and causes the other side to freak out and reveal a bit of their hand. Drama is always good for capturing people's attention. So you have a bunch of normal parents who are now paying attention to this subject, and many of whom who are so inclined might do some deeper dives on this and realize that their fears, actually they should be more alarmed than they are by just the little packet of sex ed stuff that Tommy brought home. It has deeper roots and regime implications. So anyway, I don't think it's a political loser. Can it be deployed more strategically and less gratuitously? Maybe. But this seems like a winner to me.
It's absolutely a winner, and that's why they're mad about it. Like, it's so dumb for the right to listen to the left lecture us on our tactics. Like, that's exactly that's precisely the opposite of what you should do. Like, if you see that it's driving them crazy, double down. And I love this business where they're like, this is the new Red Scare. It's like, they think that calling things the Red Scare or red baiting is the same as saying like Jew baiting or something like that, or like the Red Scare was not. I mean, there really were Reds trying to take down the U.S. government. Like,
And
that's
unlike
why,
being Jewish, being communist is actually bad.
right.
Also.
And like Curtis Yarvin makes the point, he's like, well, you can't really call the Red Scare a witch hunt because there were communists and there were no witches. So it's not like a really fair thing to say. If they want to call it a Red Scare, whatever, let them call it that. That's just on them. The Red Scare, there's nothing wrong with the Red Scare. I mean, maybe they went too far. Maybe some people got caught up in it who weren't really communists. I don't know. Probably a lot of communists got away with it. Obviously, they did, because look where we're at. I'm all for OK Groomer. I think that the point that you made, Ryan, about how the public school, I mean, I kind of feel like a lot of the Catholic Church demonization is like a projection of what the public schools are actually up to. In the same way in which like the teachers are like priests. They can be hidden, they can be transferred around, they can be protected. And a lot of the sexual abuse is, young women, teachers having sex with their male students, which is kind of a perverse arrangement. I mean, it's different, I guess. I'm all for it. And it's just so funny when you see the David Frenches of the world and whoever else saying, oh, this is beneath us. Like, we really can't fight this way. Well, what kind of fight do you want to have?
Yeah, grooming for what? And the answer is many things. But I think ultimately, foremost among them is, look, take these people at face value. The patriarchy is evil. The family is evil, embedded, encoded with natural injustice. And the only way that human beings can ever get beyond ancient hatreds and all of the sin and the wickedness that stains our society, the only way that we can purify society and purify our consciousness is by destroying permanently the authority and the habit and the memory of biological reproduction, the natural family, immutable sex characteristics. Just take them at their word. And so how do you move vast numbers of people in that direction as quickly as possible? And the answer is you use the most powerful tool that we have right now, which is technology. Thank you, computers. And you use that technology to aggressively, physically intervene in the bodies of children as young as possible in order to, this is like infant baptism, to pre-liberate them from the constraints of our given being. That is a theocratic strategy, and it is a religious establishment, an establishment of a religion, and it is one that uses non-procreative sex of any imaginable kind, and probably some kinds that are not yet imagined, although we must be scraping the bottom of the barrel at this point. Using those as a sacrament to groom, to condition, to train children for ultimately sex with the swarm of technology that we are expected to merge with. This is where this is going, is do not have children, do not reproduce, do not mate for life, do not find a partner of the opposite sex and continue on the natural family and the species. That's over. Now what there is automate eroticism, automate sex. This is good for you. This is what spirituality is now. This is where you can find a taste of the divine and the divinization of consciousness. And this is what people are being groomed for, people of all ages. And we've already seen that they want to start before a kid can even speak a sentence. They want to start this out because these people are genuinely convinced that humanity is out of runway, that we're so inherently flawed, so damaged, so sinful, and so impure, and especially in the shadow of all these robots we've created, that our only hope is to merge with those entities, liberate and purify our consciousness, and become as gods. And that's what they're being groomed to do. I mean, we've seen enough grooming where an established church was used as kind of the excuse. Oh yes, altar boys right this way, and then what's going on is something different. They've done away with the excuse, or they've turned they've turned the ulterior motive into the religion itself. And this is why we go from a year and a half ago, nobody talking about this, to present day, everyone talking about this. And the more intense that this gets, the more people are going to recognize what's really at stake and why it's really going on. This isn't just like a sexual orientation. This is something much, much bigger, much more theological than that. And the only way that this project can be advanced is by establishing a theocratic form of rule through social credit, which is what we're seeing unfold.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with basically everything that has been said. I only have one thing to add, and when Nate, who, as Ryan says, is our friend and whom we generally really think is a smart guy, when he started raising concerns about this, I was sort of thinking, like, because my first impulse is always like, hey, we found a good one, like we found a slogan that actually gets things across to people, and besides which, we're in the right. And so I was sort of self-reflecting and thinking, well, is it true that this is actually kind of rhetorically sloppy, or is ultimately going to be off-putting to people? And my one reservation, which is a reservation that I've had for a while, is that completely understandably, the normies who are being galvanized by this sick garbage, this is being presented as James points out, right? It's actually not. It's not a sexuality. It's not even like live and let live. It's a compulsory theology, but it's routinely presented as like it's either this, either you bend the knee, either you bow to the new gods, or you hate gay people. And as Wokal Distance, one of my favorite anonymous, or I guess he's not anonymous, but he's pseudonymous Twitter account, pointed out, it's like a lot more and more people are going to say, great, then back in the closet with you, right? And I do have a kind of reservation that reasonably you might look at this and say, well, I just think like this is what happens if you give an inch to anybody who's even remotely outside the norm sexually. And I obviously don't want to see that happen. And so I was thinking about it, and suddenly I realized that actually in those terms, in fact, the term "okay groomer" is actually really precise. Like it's actually carving out exactly what it is about this ideology that is so sick. It's not that we have an objection to people, adults kind of, being left alone. It's not that we want the government to be like reaching into your bedroom or whatever. It's that we don't want the government and the state and the sort of like theocratic techno apparatus that has grown like a cancer upon our regime lo these many years to be infiltrating the very brain crevices of children before they learn to speak. And I actually think that like that is, an accurate identification of the phenomenon that we are seeing that sets it apart from whatever, most nice people, I think, don't want to be like, bigots or whatever. Most people don't actually want to be like knocking on people's doors to find out what kind of sex adults are having, but they don't want grooming. That's what they don't want. And James has precisely articulated, and Ryan too, like why this constitutes grooming, even if it doesn't always in every case amount to like pedophilia. And I think that we should therefore go whole hog and saying, yes, that is exactly what we object to. It's grooming. You're groomers. And if you object to us calling you groomers, that's just more proof that you're a groomer, because your groomer fragility is emerging out of the systemic groomerism that has that has led to your being this way. I didn't make that up. There are some great tweets out there about how this is, if the left is allowed to claim that there's racism without racists, then surely there can be grooming without intent to groom or whatever. Anyway, I've used up the last of our time. Unless anybody has any last things to object, you can speak up over me as I roll gradually into the outro. But this was a fun one. Thank you guys as always. And thanks to all of you who are listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreview.books.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you all next week.